And now, the best 60-ish seconds of your week.
And it's Super Saturday, and tomorrow the world stands still as Kansas City takes on the Philadelphia Eagles in Phoenix for the Lombardi Trophy. And yes, I am a Philadelphia Eagles fan since about yay high, and I'm willing to make a prediction. The Eagles, and this is a conservative prediction, by the way, because I am a conservative, 31-28. Jalen Hurts is MVP. And there are a lot of firsts in this game, as the media has been focusing on. The Kelsey brothers, the first brothers to face one another in a Super Bowl game, and Jalen Hurts and Mahomes, the first two African-American quarterbacks to square off. Now, the media, interestingly, has focused on their race, and not on the fact that both of these young superstars, presumably both Hall of Famers at some point in the future, are devout Christians. You wonder why the media doesn't pick up on that and chooses to focus on things over which they have no control. But that's a story for another day. It's going to be a great day tomorrow, and the Eagles will take home their second Super Bowl trophy. And this week, all the news and chatter was about the State of the Union speech. You know, these State of the Union addresses always have a lot more in the hype leading up to them than in the actual speech itself. And this week, we saw Joe Biden give the American people full view of why most Americans don't want him to run again and won't support him if he does. This speech was on every level terrible. He looked bad, he sounded bad, and the message that he delivered just simply didn't square up with the reality that Americans are facing. He tried to convince us that inflation isn't really a problem for all of us. You know, inflation has gone up faster under the 2 years that Joe Biden has been in office than in any other 2-year period since Jimmy Carter, and we all remember how that worked out. Then he tried to skate past the problems at the border. For all the palaver that we got for over an hour and 15 minutes, only a couple of sentences about the border crisis, and that was simply to say everything's hunky-dory, and if there are any problems, it's as a result of Congress not putting enough money into it. I mean, nobody buys that. It just simply doesn't meet up with where people are. And then, of course, the chatter of the week, the conversation among every person in America was about this balloon that was able to waft across the entire United States before being shot down over South Carolina waters. And how much coverage did that get from the leader of the free world, the commander-in-chief of our forces, and the leader of our country? About one sentence. And that's why this speech fell under its own weight. It simply didn't square up with where America is and where reality exists. And President Biden chose to discuss the Inflation Reduction Act, his so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And if you listened to him last July, inflation was gone. It had disappeared. But of course, Americans see things very differently. And somehow he tried to take us from there into climate change. But you know what's fascinating with the discussion that comes from the left about climate change every time? It doesn't mention China, doesn't mention India, doesn't mention the outrageous costs upon Americans for what other people are doing. And that's where the real problem here lies. Biden talks about money to buy electric cars. And where does that electricity come from? How is that electricity generated? How are those cars manufactured, etc.? I mean, a world without fossil fuels is simply not one that exists. If people want a fossil fuel holiday, tell them to go maybe 48 hours without using anything that comes from a fossil fuel and see how they make out. My guess is they'll come back to you saying, maybe I need to rethink things. But of course, the woke left doesn't do that very often, so we march on into the dive that President Biden took into the old, worn out, and tired saws of the Democrat Party, which they think still appeals to a core constituency. Namely, the attack on American companies. The corporations need to pay their fair share. Now let's stop for just a second and dissect that. First, what is their fair share? And second, are corporations truly going to pay it? Because the truth of the matter is that corporations are much more tax collectors than they are taxpayers. Corporations always pass along whatever costs are to be borne by them, whether assigned to them by government or the market. Consumers pay that price. So consumers will once again pay higher taxes through the cost of goods and services coming from these corporations. And additionally, Biden wanted to scream about how unfair the tax code is. And bluntly, I agree with him. But who was there for decades writing that tax code? Joe Biden. And the myriad loopholes, deductions, special credits, etc., that are rife throughout the tax code were put there by Joe Biden and the Congress through years and years and years. And what's the one state where you have the most corporate advantages written into statute? Delaware. So, it rings a little hollow when Joe Biden tells us A, how unfair the tax code is, and B, how corporations aren't paying enough in taxes, because ultimately it means he doesn't think we're paying enough in taxes. And finally, of course, he couldn't resist an urge to talk about gun control, and talked about a term I hadn't really heard before, semi-automatic pistols. I had to think about that for a minute, because unless you're muzzle loading, I'm thinking that most pistols are semi-automatic. But this is the language of the left. That's supposed to scare people, as are assault rifles. They can't define for any of us what an assault rifle truly is, and Biden took great credit for an assault weapons ban 30 years ago that didn't work and that ultimately went away as a result, and he's crying we need to have it back. But that was the State of the Union. And finally, note this, as bad as that speech was, at the end, you didn't see Kevin McCarthy standing behind the president ripping it up. Maybe that's the difference between the liberals and the conservatives in Congress. One more thing, as we were taping this, the United States of America shot down yet another object that had come into American airspace. This time, they got it in Alaska before it was allowed to transverse down across Canada and across the entire United States. We don't know yet the particulars there. We can talk about that next week, because for now, that is the best 60-ish seconds of your week. And fly, Eagles, fly.